Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hey, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you? Nice to see you. I wanted food. No, I don't.
You don't want food?
No, I want food.
Okay, it's right
Go
there.
get food.
Okay.
It's not too late.
Okay.
To honor the idea of a family.
Okay.
Now I'm in the front row. No.
Yes. You thought you weren't.
Yeah, I know, right?
I never understand why people don't want to be in the front row.
I know.
It's as if they need an extra barrier of seats in case the lecturer should decide to attack. All of a sudden, it gives some time to flee.
I don't have work rate, but I feel like I'm more like present if I'm.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In certain classes, there's this huge, rush for the front row. In other classes, I think they're more freshmen now. They're more interested in the front row.
Oh, I would not be able to do what you all are going to do.
There you go. You can sit in the front too.
I'm not as good as you.
I'm John Hall. Yeah, I know. I meet you. I've seen you around tables.
Yeah, we haven't had it formally. Yeah. John, you're in what?
East Asian languages, humanities, literature, and things like that. How about you?
I teach here in the Department of English.
Is that why we are in this room?
I don't know why. No, it was not.
I've never been in the building except the first floor. I don't even come upstairs. It's nice.
Yeah, I've never been in this library either.
It's better inside than outside.
Yeah.
Although the architects might disagree with me.
What do you think of the new plaza?
It needs more tables.
Yeah,
It needs more tables.
need more tables.
It needs more places for people to sit. And it should be a garden of green and colorful things that people should look at, or it should have tables where people can sit, as opposed to large amounts of concrete in the middle with benches around the edges.
It still feels that way, right?
Well, it is. It's a large amount of. Concrete is white now rather than and that's an improvement. But it's still, and the benches around the edges are good. Yep.
Well, yeah, I guess I asked that because I have a strange and I like you, I'm something a little wrong. It's very structured, and it does need more shade. But I don't know. I feel it's inviting Star Trek. I've always had a problem with it. So I am puzzling out. Same thing with Moffat. They restructured Moffat, and this whole sort of like suggest collaboration in any possible new space. I feel it's going to.
Okay, everybody.
I don't know what the
Welcome. We won't start with you, Ani, we promise. So, for those that don't know, my name is Richard Freistadt. I am the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning on campus. And I have been working with Victor Sandberg, our scholarly communications officer in the library for a year now. It's been almost about a year. Around some of these larger issues related to course content, affordability, and accessibility. And that's a piece that I want to sort of interject in remarks and stage setting for the panel today. This is part of not only itself a very large-scale effort and a large-scale need and opportunity on the campus, but is part of something that's even larger in how affordability and accessibility of course materials interplay for our students. At the campus level, starting last spring, we were charged by the Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Education to put together a campus-wide committee of faculty, staff, and students, both from the undergraduate and graduate levels, to look at course content affordability and accessibility, not just across the campus, but benchmark with our peer institutions to see what are the opportunities for us to do this better, to reduce costs for our students so that they're not worried about can they find food, can they afford rent, so that we can increase the accessibility of our course content materials so that our students with any sort of DSP accommodation or need can have no problem accessing materials, reading them, understanding them, engaging with them, and these two really go hand in hand. And what we found, and I think what you'll see today when you hear from the panelists, is that if we fix one, we ultimately fix the other at the same time. And so while today we're really looking at an affordability pilot and what some of our faculty have done around increasing the affordability of course materials, at the same time the underlying piece here is in doing so they've also made them more accessible for students. This is accessible PDFs, screen readers, links in B courses to already remediated content and things like that that are addressing affordability but accessibility at the same time. And so this spring, the campus committee that I'm co-chairing now will have a report to senior leadership on campus and to the campus as a whole with recommendations about how to surface, scale, and make sustainable some initiatives like this one that are having such incredible impact, not just for our faculty and pedagogy, but for our students, their learning, and ultimately their lives here at Berkeley and beyond. So just some very broad stage setting remarks. With that, I'll turn it over to Rachel to kick off the panel.
Thanks, everyone. So, kind of this is as Richard mentioned, this problem is happening on a national scale with the inability to afford the additional costs of college that people don't necessarily plan for in advance, which are really expensive textbooks and course readers. And if you look at the kind of information that's coming out of schools nationwide, who have spent a few more years than we have studying this problem, this is the kind of feedback you get from students, that they can't afford to pay their rent, or they could have paid rent with what it costs to pay for a semester's worth of textbooks, and that they couldn't enroll in as many classes as they wanted to because of the cost of their course content. The reason why these statements are common is because the cost of textbooks has risen 88% in the past decade alone. Usually textbooks are over $200 each, and post all of the links in B courses instead of making students go buy a $150 print course pack. Or if you'd rather post PDFs of the materials, then we can help you make a fair use decision to actually upload content instead of the link alone. So course packs are another piece of this puzzle that we need to address. The problem is that when students can't afford to buy course materials, we have a social justice problem. If students don't have access, if some students don't have access to the same materials that others do, they're not going to do as well in class. And if some students have immediate access while others don't, who might need to wait longer to save up enough money to buy the course content, there's a disparity there too in class performance. So that was why we've teamed up with the Center for Teaching and Learning to run a pilot, which we got chartered from the Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Education and the University Library, to address this two-pronged problem. What are we going to do about course packs, and what are we going to do about the cost of textbooks? And over there, as on your way out, you can grab some of these postcards that I'm showing right now, and I have to say the colors in real life are much better than what you're seeing up here. But basically, our pilot had 3 different prongs. One prong was a syllabus processing service. So give us your syllabus. We will find everything because we actually have it, or it's online already, and we can give you links to everything. Or if you want to put PDFs up, let us work with you to make fair use decisions. Second prong was, look, let's say this is an English class and you are assigning 12 books, not textbooks, but 12 books to read. Let us get electronic copies of those books with enough license seats so that all of your students can use it at the same time, so that they at least have the option of accessing those books electronically for free to them. The library absorbs the cost. For free to them so that they don't have to purchase a print copy of the book if they don't want to. And the third prong is, let's actually do something really innovative here. There is a universe of materials called open educational resources, and these are essentially open teaching content. They could be anything from modules to full open textbooks, and the sky is kind of the limit on what these open textbooks might look like. They could be a traditional book, and you can see it online for free anywhere around the world, and it will scroll and interact like a regular print book, or it could be something entirely more interactive. But the idea is that these open textbooks are online for free, not just for use here, but for anyone around the world. And so we incentivize the creation of these open textbooks with $5,000 grants. And actually, even to sweeten the deal of just getting your mind around the idea that we might be offering e-books in general instead of print books, even category 2 of let us check to see if we can get licenses for you. We even pay faculty members to get comfortable with that idea as well. So really, I think the stories you're going to hear from the folks participating today, and I will say that Ani, who's in the statistics department, the data science program has already been doing some of this already, so she's going to share her experience not as part of this pilot, but the work that they've already done in making content available for free. And I think the stories you're going to hear today are not just about savings, but also innovation. So with that, we will turn it over to the panelists. We'll start with Daniel Rodriguez, who's a professor of city and regional planning, then Brad DeLong, professor of economics, John Wallace, a lecturer in the Japanese program, and Ani Adhikari, a teaching professor with the statistics department. So thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Richard, thank you. So I'm going to describe briefly the course that I used to apply this innovation. It's an upper-level undergraduate course called Sustainable Mobility, so it's mostly for juniors and seniors. Students from many different departments joined that course. We have about 65 to 70 students. And the normal practice that I see in my colleagues around these upper-level courses, maybe graduate courses, chapters, papers, reports, and assembling them in what we call this course pack. The common practice had been to send that course back to a copy center, and hopefully they'll deal with the copyright issues, although we maintained a distance, so we were not even sure that that was happening. But probably more likely they were passing the copyright cost and the copying cost to the students, as Rachel was identifying. So one idea was indeed to gather the readings ahead of time, or the links to the readings, and put together this course pack so that students can have access to them on their devices, and maybe address some of the other concerns about cost through perhaps printing the course pack and making it available at different libraries in the sort of a hard copy. So the process of this pilot on the course pack really addressed a variety of issues. The first one is the laborious job of putting together all the readings or the links. And that was just wonderful to hand them the syllabus, and then they would find all the readings and collate them all into the single document. They also updated them to B-courses, and so I kind of suggested an architecture. Here's how I would like them organized, and we agreed on a file naming convention for all the different PDFs or the links, and they would get uploaded. Sometimes they were giving me very helpful advice about fair use. So they said, you know, you're using 3 chapters of this book. This is not legal advice, but you know, it's a line, so here's how we can address that. And that's where the link to the resources online through the library address that issue. In some cases, for example, we had only 1 or 2 or 3 e-copies of that book. And they very generously said, well, we might need more, so let's go with 8 or 9, so that at one point in time, 8 or 9 students could be addressing or borrowing that book virtually at once without finding these bottlenecks of the numbers involved. So that was very helpful as well. To give you a sense of the time frame, the collating of the documents happened in the last week of July, first week of August. So it worked pretty well. And frankly, I had a lot of the documents already. Not all, but the vast majority of them. And I sent it to the library. And interestingly, one thing that happened was they said, well, you know, some of these came from your other institutions. You kind of collected them over time. We are really more comfortable doing it ourselves. Partly also because we wanted to have a certain quality, and we wanted to let the text be readable for someone that might have a disability. And that was really, really important, it turned out, because much of the students have special needs in terms of how to access the text, and having optical character recognition available for them was really, really important. I don't know how my students feel about the pack yet. I can kind of anticipate some things. When I first told them about the pack and the availability on B-courses and then on hard copies at the library and here, 2 copies of each, they were really excited. They were almost high-fiving each other. And we did go ahead and price out how much it would cost to print this through the copy center, commercial printing service, and it would be about $150 to $175. So that's kind of a savings directly in their pocket. We'll see what happens at the end. We are going to have a survey to evaluate their experience. As an instructor, my concerns were, well, you know what, some people really like the hard copy. So that's why we printed the unreserved documents. But we'll see. I also have these memos that I ask students now to submit at the beginning of class to make sure that they're reading the document, the readings ahead of class. And I think the coverage is not that great. I think about 50 to 60% of the students are doing the readings. It's a little lower than in the past when we had the readers, but the hard copy. But we'll see. So compliance, if you will, with the readings, I think has gone down a little bit. I hear that they like it because of portability, so they can be on a train, they can be embarked, they just bring it up on their laptop, they bring it up on an iPad or some sort of tablet, and they can do some of the reading there, they can annotate it there. That's helpful. I also added another piece to this, which is that I upload my PowerPoint slides ahead of time for each of my lectures. So basically twice a week, I upload those ahead of time, and some students either bring them up in their computer and make notes, others print them up ahead of time and make notes on the PowerPoint. And what I've heard is that this is really, really helpful because they're able to kind of track the content and identify questions, annotate as needed, expand
it was 2 volumes. Yes, I have a lot of readings. And the copy center, just a regular copy center on campus, said just printing alone was $130. So if a student did want to take all of the materials that were uploaded in resources and get them printed out, that would be $130. But if a copy center were going to print it for you, they would also do all of the copyright clearances. So that's where that a little over $150 comes in.
But people could buy printed copies this semester here.
They could print anything on their own here in the library if they wanted to as well. But you touch on a good point, which is getting a campus-wide solution, print-on-demand solution, is absolutely something we're addressing as part of the committee.
Yeah. And the other comment I received from students that was very, very positive is, when I move, I'm just going to move the books that are really, really close to what I'm doing. But I can take these files and have them in a hard disk drive, and they're coming with me. So that's an interesting effect that we will only know long term how it's benefiting them. But my sense is that it's good for them. I would love to do this again for my next class.
You're welcome to. We're running it again in the spring.
There you go. And so, as I mentioned it to my colleagues, they were like, "Wow, this is there's really no downside to this, with the exception of the ability to have a printed copy with them, which is still available if they want to go ahead and print it out themselves." So let me stop my remarks there, and then we might have.
Any questions? We'll do questions after we.
Okay. Yeah.
I have a couple questions about the material that is licensed to a limited number of people from the library.
So the articles are not licensed to a limited number of people. It's just if he assigned chapters from books, if we had a print book and it was just one chapter, we would scan the one chapter in, and he makes a fair use decision, and that's fine. If it's a book where he has assigned 3 chapters from, then we looked to see if we could get electronic copies with enough access so that everyone could access it at once. And if we couldn't, then we got multiple electronic copies. And for those, we provided links rather than uploads, because it was more than one chapter at a time.
I see. So I guess my question is, if you got something that's limited number, then presumably people have to keep it for a limited amount of time, and then they no longer have access to it. So my question is, in that situation, are they allowed to print it?
Yeah.
Yes, they can. So if you are accessing any of our, and this is again just for books because articles are different, it's unlimited. But if you are accessing a book, you can download 60 pages at a time as a user and jump out of it.
And keep it?
Yeah.
I see. Because I was going to ask if you want to annotate it.
You can download a PDF. Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question just to clarify. What is the mechanism of access for students besides B-courses? Are you developing something new?
No.
It is on B-courses.
It is on B-courses. So the links that are being provided are to library licensed resources, or in a lot of cases, these materials are already online. And so a copy center would actually be charging for permissions for things that are already online. So those links were added. We created in each of the B-course sites for the classes who are participating. We created a readings module, and we went week by week and put each week's readings in there. And again, you can choose PDF or link, depending.
Do you have a sense if students are switching over to annotating online or using sort of different apps or software to accomplish that?
Yeah, so my sense is that maybe 15, 20%, 25% of students are doing that. It's hard to know because sometimes they don't bring their tablets or their computers to class. So I think some are doing it, and I think that's one area where at least from my side, I don't have the proficiency to very quickly annotate things online, and I find that it's a little difficult. And maybe it's a skill that needs to be developed that's important for this type of product. Thank you.
And now we're going to hear from Brad Long.
Okay.
And I will pull up his presentation.
All right.
Once I see where. Hang on one sec. I do have a lot of things open, and I apologize.
That's it?
Here we are. Okay, great.
Okay. Let me see. All right, it's happy. Looking for the plus button on Chrome.
Okay.
And it's hidden off to the right. Okay, nice plus button on Chrome. Now looking for the scroll bar on Chrome.
Oh, I scroll, I'm old, so I scroll in the normal way. So if you just...
okay.
Okay. So once we get in here, you can just... Oops. Oh, now it's like frozen or something. Hang on 1 second. No, it's just... Let me...
If you push the
play button. Okay.
Great. That looks great. All right. This is going to be enormous fun. Over the next 5, 10, 20, or 50 years. Enormous fun for lots of reasons, because we're going to have the opportunity to fix something that's gone horribly wrong with scholarly communication and education, and also expand our intellectual space in a number of amazing ways. So let me put on my economic historian hat, and in trying to talk about 2017, 2018, let me go back, not all the way to 1000, but let me go back to 1451. The University of Glasgow has just been founded. It is the only university in Western Scotland. Just how many copies of the Nicomachean Ethics are there in Western Scotland anyway? Well, they gotta have one. Maybe a few bishops have incredibly literate clerks who have others as prestige items. But still, there are a bunch of people, a lot of theologians, a lot of judges, a lot of clerks, a lot of so forth, who would like at least a passing acquaintance with Aristotle's arguments on ethics. So what do you do? 1, 2, or 5 copies, and maybe a community of 30 people a year going through the educational system and then heading to jobs in the church or working for the king, who want to see and hear this thing. Well, pretty much all you can do, given that your average monk can only copy 3,000 words a day, and do so at the price of massive carpal tunnel injuries, plus extremely bad effects on their eyesight, especially if you make them work through the Scottish winter, where there are 4 hours of sunlight a day by the light of only one candle. You assemble everyone in this year's cohort in a room in Glasgow, at the University of Glasgow. You make them listen to the book being read aloud and take your notes, and hence lecture, an educational talk, from the late Middle English word for reading. Right? The lecturer is not, in his origins, talking, he's just reading. Maybe he's choosing what to read. That's the original root word from legere. But a lecture is a reading aloud of a text. Why are you reading aloud the text? Well, because the scribe can only do 3,000 words a day. Now, the middle of the 15th century also sees Johannes Gutenberg come along. And by 1480, we know that in Florence, the Rippoli Press will produce 1,025 copies of the Dialogues of Plato for a price of 3 florins. 50 years earlier, or even contemporaneously, a scribe would produce 1 copy for 1 florin. That means that just Gutenberg's printing press itself, plus the next 30 years of innovations, decreased the price of books by 300 times. And it's certainly true that there is a book called In Praise of Scribes, I think published not by Rippoli, but by one of its competitors, about how this was a horrible loss. Because when you bought a book, you hadn't internalized it. But if you had made your own copy of it by hand, word by word, you had a much better and much deeper knowledge of the book, and that the only way to truly read a book was to write it out by hand, and then it was yours. They printed it. In Praise of Scribes survives, because they didn't restrict it to samizdat hand copy, kind of reproduction. They printed it up using Gutenberg's press. Since then, we've had another factor of 20. So that nowadays, kind of the production cost of a book's about $10, more or less, a big, thick hardcover with good design values. Factor of 700 change since the Middle Ages. That means when you think of a book in the Middle Ages, you think that it's something that costs the same amount of the average wage then that $70,000 is today. Chaucer's clerk in the Canterbury Tales is thin and skinny, and indeed, when he has a little money, he buys books, and when he has more, he might buy food, and he never gets to clothes. The 20 books in his library are the equivalent for his time of having $1.4 million spent on something. It's the equivalent of owning a house in Elmwood free and clear right now. And as books become incredibly cheap, all of a sudden the lecture doesn't change its name, but it changes its function. It becomes part of structured repetition in different channels. You use your eyes to read the text, you use your ears to hear the lecture, you then go and you write notes during the lecture, thus getting some muscle memory in there, which turns out to be especially valuable in computer science. That it's impossible to learn computer science by reading a textbook or listening to a lecture. You really have to have your hands on the keys for it to work at all. You present summaries, you use concepts, all of the stuff we now talk about multiple channel learning and structured repetition. That really becomes very possible with Gutenberg in a way that it hadn't before. And then lectures also become commentaries on texts. The best lecture series I ever took was Michael Walzer on modern political philosophy, where he would pick out what he thought were 4 key paragraphs from, say, Rousseau's Social Contract, and read each of them aloud and then talk about each of them for 12 minutes each. Lectures as highlights of what you're going to read in the text, as dialogues with the students, either real or constructed about the text. For all of these, you need access to the text, and you need ready access to the text. It has to be at your hand all the time. It has to be affordable and accessible. But that really shouldn't be a problem, right? It only costs $10 to print up an extra copy of a book and get it into your hot little hands. Why is this a problem in a society as rich as ours? Well, it's a problem because the market system is going badly wrong here. That is, we like competitive markets. Suppose there were a bunch of textbooks about all equally good, and the market would work in the sense that students would come out there looking for a book, and one book would be cheaper than the other, and they're all reasonably good. And if there were enough publishers, they wouldn't be able to sustainably collude, and they'd undercut each other. And eventually the price of the textbook would be down to more or less its cost of production plus normal profits. And everyone for whom the book was worth more than its cost of production would get one. And there'd be this enormous big surplus triangle to the people using the book. The difference between their valuation of the book, the price at which they are thinking, gee, maybe I really don't need to buy this thing at all, maybe I can't afford it, and its cost, that's pure surplus, that's pure gravy, that's intellectual wealth, that's prosperity. So we ought to be selling all of our books we ought to be charging people $10 a book per course, per semester, here at Berkeley. That's the cost of production. That ain't what's going on. What's going on? Well, it becomes a not-so-competitive market pretty quickly. The problem is that there is always one textbook that's a better fit, the assigned textbook. So that textbook can charge more, up to a limit price, where people start to think the textbook with the best fit is not worth it. And they do charge more, because after all, authors like money, and publishers like money even more. And maybe authors would rather have it priced a little less than sell more copies, but they soon find if they beat on the publisher to get it to charge it a little less, the publisher's representatives won't push it, and in fact they sell fewer rather than more copies. So a bunch of the surplus that ought to go to people buying and reading the book goes instead to the authors who are lucky enough for their book to find a nice set of home courses, and you get this green rectangle flowing as surplus to the publishers and to the authors. And, it's not such a good thing from the educational point of view, And the problem is that each book is a best fit book for its own home courses. And so the market can, and overwhelmingly, as I look around, I see that the market for textbook does settle at an equilibrium in which each book charges the full monopoly price for its home courses, and in which competition among publishers happens when publishers compete not on price, but on services to the teachers to peel away other books' home courses. What does this mean? Well, 20,000 students at Berkeley, right, more or less. 8 courses a year, more or less. $200 per book, more or less. That's $32 million per year, right? What could we do with $32 million per year? And we do have more students with Pell Grants coming to Berkeley than any place else in the United States, except than in the entire Ivy League, for example. And for a lot of them, 200 times 8, $1,600 is a big charge. That we're a rich society, but they are not rich people now. And that hits their access substantially, hits their standard of living substantially, hits their ability to believe they can afford it substantially. They could make much better use of that $1,600 than we could putting into the pockets of lucky authors plus publishers. Why do we accept this? Well, in a sense, it's all the professor's fault that they decide on books and course structure. They don't feel the impact of their decisions on student pocketbooks. They don't say, well, gee, I'm presenting this material in a way analogous to chapters 3 of this book, 4 of this book, 6 of that book, and 7 of this book. You could use any of those. They're about pretty good. They give a slightly different view of the material. I have my own. Here it is. Instead, the professors invariably adopt the notation of one particular textbook because it's the one that sends them the transparencies. And textbooks are very, very interested in making sure that their chapter overlaps and their notations are such as to make it difficult to move between one textbook and another, and even to move between the 7th edition and the 8th edition. That the rule of thumb in textbook publishing is the difference between the 7th edition and the 8th edition has to be just enough that it's really painful to use the 7th edition for an 8th edition task. And professors don't feel the impact of their decisions on student pocketbooks. Perhaps we don't have sufficient empathy for our students and their lives. Perhaps we just don't think or don't think very hard. Sometimes we do. David Romer, when teaching Econ 1, went to the publishers and said, these 4 books all look acceptable. I'll give the Berkeley business to whichever one of you offers me a deal, the best deal on a special ISBN. Got the textbook, I think it was Bernanke's, for $100 rather than $280. Turned out the following semester, the same textbook was being used at Stanford and was being sold at $150 on the used book market. And so Berkeley students could clear $50 in 6 months if they bought the textbook and then found someone to drive it down to Stanford. My high school rolled the cost of books into tuition. And then the high school as a whole went out and bargained with publishers. And indeed would go back to the teachers and saying, you really want this particular edition of the Scarlet Letter? We can get this one for... And there are all kinds of those negotiations are always fraught. And you don't necessarily trust the university bureaucracy to do your negotiating for you. But still, publishers with an effective monopoly on the one hand, individual professors choosing books without thinking very much about the cost for students on the other, that's not going to end well. So what is to be done? Well, Marty Olney, in the office next door at the economics department, and I were sitting around grousing this for a while. And then we said, wait a minute, we have this textbook that's a decade old now that badly needs to be revised, that the publishers are willing to give us the rights to it back. Why do we revise and update it? And why don't we then distribute it for free? Give away the ebook version sell a print-on-demand version for enough to cover our costs for $30 or so, use it for Econ 101B next semester in the spring, and see where this takes us. We will use it for 100 or 300 students when we teach, because it's our textbook. We like it. It has the best fit with what we do. But there are also 1,000 other students taking analogous courses on these courses when we don't teach them at Berkeley each year. Maybe we can convince them to adopt it. And then maybe we can go big or go home. That is, if the main textbook is living as an ebook, then there's a strong incentive to update it every semester, which means there's a very strong incentive to update or to computerize the updating process. Make it so that for each graph, we simply download the latest version of the data file from fred.stlouisfed.gov and plug it in. And once we've done it so that we are automatically drawing our graphs in R or Python code and automatically updating the book, well, why not then peel back the curtain with the ebook version? Let people access not just a PDF ebook, but also the underlying files that produce the graphs and the analyses and the kind of figures, and let them play with them. And then playing with the code that produces the figures, what happens if you change this, what happens if you change that, turn that into the problem sets. And at this point, all of a sudden, we're all teaching not just an economics, but a data science course, because we have to add computer literacy. And once we've added computer literacy, once we're making people program their problem sets up in Python and submit them as Jupyter notebooks to OK.py, well, then we've solved another potential problem, which is that this year the economics department is doing an old-fashioned labor speed-up. Instead of having to teach 2 sections of 30 for 60 students for your 50% GSI appointment, you now have to teach 3 sections of 25, 75 students for your 50% GSI appointment. And of course, you have to do this while still remaining within the 20 hours of the union contract, while also providing excellent teaching services to the students and pleasing the people who may well be your dissertation advisors in the future by just as much. We can see where this is going. Taking the problem set grading load off of the GSIs seems to be an unanticipated benefit of this as well. So we're going to try to go big or go home here, and we'll tell you how it goes in a year or so. Thank you.
But just to let you guys know, so students in the data science program are coding this for Brad and Martha, and it will be rendered, so it will be in HTML online and then also downloadable as an ebook, and will be archived in the scholarship, which is the institutional repository. So there are a variety of publishing. This is going to be available in a variety of different ways.
It's going to be great fun.
Yes.
Did you get my email?
I did not. I can check it.
Yeah.
Oh,
And then you need to get
okay,
the,
great.
I
What?
sent it to you.
Okay.
Let me see. The fact that they liked us, the fact that they didn't really want to put out another edition of it because they thought their money was better spent elsewhere. The fact that they want an ongoing relationship with us as well. Especially with Marty, because Marty does study guides for other econ textbooks at lots of levels, which are very good indeed. So, yeah.
Does that include the cost of preparing the manuscript, or just the cost of physically producing the book?
It's just the cost of physically producing, but at large enough scale, the manuscript preparation costs are teeny, which is why the stock price of North Holland Elsevier right now is so high.
Are you?
More questions? Yeah?
So, I looked at the chart that you had about how, the textbook publishers can charge close to a monopoly price, and when you think of an industry that's charging prices like that, you think of like a flash industry. I know
Yes.
struggling.
Okay.
Great, got it.
Product, and we're struggling because the prices are so high.
Mhm.
What's gonna happen?
Now, one thing is that publishers are spending a lot of money competing to peel off home courses from other textbooks. Yeah, that by the time you've prepared lecture notes and transparencies and run conference this and conference that and conference other, and provide an online forum where professors can ask for help in constructing their lectures and answering questions. And taken people out to dinner and so forth, and fed them alcohol to try to get textbook adoptions. That is, by the time you've done that, you may well have spent a lot of those monopoly profits away. And also, textbook publishers suffer from the same over-optimism biases as pretty much everyone else does. And so they are usually willing to give too much up front in the way of advances to people who they think are going to be big hits. And indeed, because, look, they're salesmen and saleswomen. They're good at it. And they're good at selling to both sides, right? They're good at both selling the textbook to professors for adoptions, and they're also good at selling the advance of a textbook author they like to their corporate CEOs as well. So it's a market in which a few people do extremely well, and a number finds that somehow they're struggling, even though prices are vastly in excess of social cost. And whenever price is in excess of social cost, there are monopoly rents, and there's someplace. The question is, where are they going, or how are they being dissipated?
Thank you. So we're going to turn it over to John Wallace now, who is also doing an open textbook, but vastly different from economics.
And we just switched over because I've got a new laptop, and it's USB-C, and they don't convert to VGA at all. After the so this is pretty straightforward. Why did I decide to do this? Actually, the cost of books in my field is always high, and so it's okay. So I can move it over here. Thank you. I'll just forward you guys. Okay, very nice. But we were used to paying 10, 15 years ago. So for me, what this is doing is allowing me to bring stuff back into my course. I've always prepared my own material because I couldn't ask students in classical Japanese to buy a book that they don't even want to be in the class to start with. You're not going to pay $150 for a book on Japanese. I've been solving that problem of affordability by just simply not bringing textbooks to the room and generating my own material for a very long time. So my problem is that I've got a lot of material that's in a gangly shape. B courses, it's hard to access, and ebook solves that problem for me by bringing it all together. I should read chapter 1 instead of read this on the module and the B course. So that's been an unexpected benefit to being in the shape of the B course. And then this I just typed in while I was listening to the introduction. Yes, I would really like that. I had a number of handouts, and they're all in one place now, and they are accessible because they're digital material, and they can print it from ebook as they would like to. And I also added this because I'd forgotten, in that in the ebook, if you want, you can put a voice annotation there at the beginning of the chapter, what this is about, why you're doing it, where the problems are, and you can update it like that. And I've read a couple of ebooks that have that interactive aspect where the author is talking about what they did. Found those 1 or 2 minute audio files to help me orient myself to the chapter. So I haven't done that yet, but that is something you can do with an ebook that I think is very nice. On the students' end, I did use this during the summer. I was very surprised at how quickly they adopted it. I didn't have to. They were delighted. It just went smooth as could be. It's like I just changed my stuff. It's an ebook. Okay, fine, and done. They never asked me where it was, how to use it, anything like that. It was very smooth. That was easy. And then, unlike B course, it's easy for students to annotate, to highlight. It's searchable, and it's rapid navigation. Ebooks are great that way. You can work offline, and that's a good thing. And you can work outside of CalNet, and that's a good thing, I think, a lot of times. And it's mobile device friendly the way B-Course isn't. And so you had mentioned the tablets, but half of my students are now working just on their phone. They do their essays on the phone, too, when we're doing essay answers. So, I used to run my own public website, and I gave up trying to keep up with all the mobile device changes, because it's just so intense. instruction, the things that this has been, I think, especially interesting to me is that this particular book is a project that I've had in the back of my mind for more than 10 years. I didn't plan on writing it until after I retired, really, because it's large, complicated, and kind of scary. And what happened was, with this fluid content, I can go ahead and get it partway there and feel that I can keep working on it. So the ebook created for me a provisional space to think aloud and to work on things and to put it out there anyway, but I can still say, you know, I'm not finished thinking about this. This is where my thinking is at this particular point in time. I have found that to be very challenging and very liberating, both. And I'm having a lot of fun and a lot of stress writing this because I'm actually doing it instead of putting it off. But I feel like, okay, you just don't understand yet, but this is what you do understand, put it out there. That has been probably my main reason for doing the ebook, is this forum for thinking aloud. But I can also update it. We work with films, and some of my films look dated. After 2 or 3 years, I need a new film, and this is an easy, once the whole package is made, and you don't have to go searching what parts of B-Course needed to be updated because it's just all in one place. So I found it to be revisable nicely, easy to update, correct or adjust. I'm a terrible typist, so there's always mistakes. This has been a bit of a, what I mean here is that, unlike, let's say that if I was going to publish this through an academic press, your audience is probably the specialists in your field, or maybe more general people in like Japanese literature and East Asian studies. And this is, I've been able to address the students directly, and I find that to create a different environment in communicating my information than if I was kept thinking about the general reader and how I should put it for them. That's been a plus for me in this case. It feels a little bit awkward, and I'm not quite used to it, but I've decided I was going to speak directly to the students and deliver this material to them, and anybody else who wants to come in, that's okay. But it creates a sort of an intimacy that I haven't usually had with handouts and more general. That's been an unexpected plus. I use Pressbooks, and it's good enough. I think it's good enough. There's some things that I wish it could do, but that it doesn't. But it looks like this, and this is what the initial. This doesn't translate very well on the screen. I see. This is the widescreen here. This is what the front page looks like. It's relatively easy to work with. You have your usual edit like that. Yeah, and this I just wanted to note is British Columbia has a manual out there for working with ebooks that is very good. Besides the Pressbooks has their own manual, but Canada's been working at Open Textbooks for a while, and it's got some good material out there. And I know that this is hard to read here, but the reason that I've been providing my email address, my website address, is because I put this presentation up for you if you just want to grab it. And that is, last thing, some problems that I've come across are tips. Web versions of ebooks, they will keep the whole chapter, it'll deliver you the whole chapter in the window, so you have to scroll a lot to get down to the bottom of it. And so there is a way to put page dividers in there so that it will say go to page 2, go to page 3. The iBook form and the Kindle form automatically create the pages, but not the web form. So if you're going to dump in your chapter, know that it's going to be really long on screen, and that can be really irritating to scroll around. So put in some page breaks. That's the command form for the page breaks. And then MS Word is not very good. It's not very good at converting MS Word headings. It's only sort of good. It gets most of them, 80% of them, and the other ones it just leaves as plain text, so you need to go back and check that. And then this little weird thing, which is that it doesn't translate Microsoft Word footnotes automatically. You have to click on a button that says FN, and then it will convert your notes and put them in the right place. Otherwise, it puts them in various places, and so more than once. And when you convert this, it will take it out of those various places and leave little dots behind it. Go back and get this dot com. But at least know that if you go here and you click on this, you can convert your footnotes. That's just a random comment. Then, yes, I'm not on my computer, so I can't show you my website. But is your browser open?
Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, if you just do, this should work. Then I
renders like a book. And it's free to use online. Anyone can create a Pressbook. If you want one that doesn't have any watermarks with Pressbooks on it, then I'll pay for it for you. It's $99 to get a free and clear version of it. And I'm looking at trying to do an enterprise license so that anyone on campus who wants to create one would be able to. And support me in this, so if you like it, back me up on that. But what's great about Pressbooks is that, like John said, it's not perfect, but it is extremely user-friendly, because if you've ever done any kind of like a WordPress blog, it works exactly like a WordPress blog on the back end. So it's very easy to edit, and then it gives you a lot of customization in terms of how you want your book to be formatted and look. With all of this, the library still needs to get you like an ISBN for the book and to help work with channels so that it's available whether on Amazon for downloading at a cost, or you want to put it on your website to be downloaded for free. It can be downloaded in any kind of ebook reader format as well as a PDF, and you can also download it as XML. So that's just a bit about the platform that he's using.
Yeah, the export is you just click off the buttons that you want the formats, and you just hit export, and then 30 seconds later they're all there.
And then you can embed the downloads into the web version.
I guess one of my mechanical problems now is that I need to keep certain material within vCourse because of copyright issues. And so, and that's obviously the films have to be that way. And Pressbooks will allow a limited amount of multimedia content, but it's fairly short and it's small. So when I'm working with films, I have to figure out a way to link this to something beyond Pressbooks.
That's absolutely something that we need to address at campus level, which is having storage through the IT system of campus, so that all of any kind of clips or materials you're making, copyright aside, let's say that it wasn't a copyright issue, but that those would be able to be preserved and embedded. And that's something that eScholarship, they're building a site for us on eScholarship where we can actually display and store content for all of the content, all of the open materials being created, whether it's Brad's stuff or your stuff. We will have our own Berkeley dedicated open textbook site on eScholarship.
Yes. How easy was it to just insert images, JPEG, whatever?
Yeah, it's just like say a PowerPoint. It has an image, insert image thing, and then you find it on your laptop and click OK and it comes in.
So it's the same, and you can make sure it looks the way you want, and you can have the text below or around it.
Yeah, you can wrap the text. It's not completely easy, but that's not really an issue.
Okay.
Yeah. And basically I just got a Microsoft Word document that's 40,000 words long or whatever, and I'm just dumping it in as I'm ready to go. And the only thing is, because you have to do these little tweaking things, you don't want to keep putting new drafts in and tweaking the same thing over and over again. So I can make sure it's clean over in the MS Word before I turn it.
You can edit if you're starting from scratch, you might want to think about going direct editing and writing directly in Pressbooks.
Yeah, you can.
But you can dump in something that's whatever 40,000 words that also has like 5 images in it. In that same.
Yeah, you'll have to work with the images.
I was running to think of flying anywhere, because that's what I've seen.
And it's a window by window jump. You can try putting the whole thing in, and I tried, and it will get most of it, but not enough to really make it workable. It's really better. They suggest, and I think they're right, just go chapter by chapter, create the structure first, have the different chapters, and then dump in chapter at a time like that. That works a lot better than when we do one document. But it does, in theory, read the heading one and will create some document in theory. Yeah.
Making it actually look like a book. Like something that could be printed out, that has been printed out and then has gone one step back and is now a tablet version of what a book would look like, whether it's in PDF, EPUB, Mobi, whatever format, turns out to be very important.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to expand on why is that important, and also on the question of tone. Right? That is, we started out with a number of different tones. The very first books are we're overhearing Socrates' conversation with Thrasymachus. And the reason all these things are being said is because Socrates is having this very involved conversation with Thrasymachus. And then we go on to people telling you stories, right? Reader, I married him. Further on to things that recognize the reader is reading the book. By the swift compression of the pages beneath their right, the reader must be aware that we're reaching the conclusion of the story. And then we settled on something much more formal and academic. And yet you seem to be finding now that we're moving a bit back toward directly addressing the students as the single proper author of the textbook. Anything more you have to say about either of those two-dimensional points would, I think, be extremely helpful, because we don't really know this and we need to.
Yeah, I actually spent a long time trying to decide what voice I wanted to use for this. And I think it was in part because there's a lot of theory in this book, and so if I keep it in an objective sort of textbook or academic press tone, I felt like I needed to be more final in my positions. Yeah. And so part of why I address the students is to limit the forum and present it as something that I'm working out with you over the semesters, and I may feel differently next semester. And so I really was kind of pushed out of that other tone, in part because of the nature of this book, where there's still a lot of moving parts. I've been thinking about these things for 10 years, and boy, my thinking has changed a lot on quite a bit of this. And for example, because we interpret romantic storylines within novels, now I have a number of students who, because of transgender issues, these are very important ways for them to look at romantic storylines, and they interpret things quite different because of that. And I feel like I need a section on transgender and transgender perspective and how that affects how you interpret a romantic story. Even a year ago, I wouldn't have thought of doing that, and surely that's going to happen again a year from now. So I think that keeps, this is ever-moving terrain for me. So I think the informal, for this class, this text, I think informal is good, although I feel, I don't know, uncomfortable with it in a way, but that's where I am right now. I may go back and rewrite the whole thing and change it, but for now.
I just want to underscore one thing that John mentioned about kind of building as you go, is that if you don't want to start from scratch with creating an entire textbook, you can do individual modules that would work if some other textbook exists and you want one piece that's missing. And that's what we did for Horst Rademacher in the geology department. We put a module of his into Pressbooks, and you can see, I mean, it navigates the same way that a regular book would. Let's go to Meat Body. You can click on any chapter, and if you just want to have a module done this way, that's another opportunity. Okay, we're going to turn it over to Ani to talk about what they've been doing in Data 8.
That it is the premier teaching department. The great books have been Shea, Lehman, Bryman, Friedman, Designer Purvis, Rice, Pittman, one after another, the great books that are read in undergraduate programs the world over and PhD programs the world over come from our department. And so, the third and fourth floors of Evans Hall just below Breck could have been a hive of those unempathetic professors who don't think about their students and love royalties. Unfortunately, however, the reality is quite different in my department.
Yes.
And as a graduate student in the 1980s here, I remember one of these authors that I named successfully fighting their publisher, who was wanting to keep the price the same and make the binding very weak so that it would dent the second-hand market. So we have been fighting publishers for quite some time. And so I want to give you an idea now. Let me see if I'm not going to have technical difficulties. So one of the textbooks, Pittman's Probability book, which is used every semester here and at many okay, so there's the Amazon page for Pittman's Probability book, and that's being sold on Amazon for $103, and there are other books, $130, 200 something. Okay, but it's published by Springer, and let me not get started about that. However, here is Springer's page for the book, and it's ebook 79, regular book 109, but look at this. Access this title on Springer link. Springer, if you have a .berkeley.edu address and you're using, if you are using Airbase 2, one of our, then you click here, you actually do click here, it's not going to take you to a porn site. And it says you have access, you can download the PDF for free. But much better than that, you can somewhere here for $25 you can buy a soft cover of this book, and that has been wonderful. It's just been absolutely wonderful. It's been like this for a few years, and the students who used to come with the downloaded version of the book that was illegally posted by somebody in some other country now all come with the soft cover. And why do I love that? Because they are now not doing what I told them not to do, which is do not read mathematics like a novel. Always have a pencil. Right? So if they bring this soft cover book, they haven't spent much money on it, so they don't mind, they write all over it. And that's exactly what I want. I want them to be writing all over those books, and I want them to be keeping those books, and that's not monstrous, the soft cover one. And it's filled with their own work, so it stays. And that is a wonderful thing. So this is one way of giving students access. That is, the traditional publishers can and are doing, and I never thought I would stand up and say lovely things about Springer, but yeah, you know what? It's a model for other publishers.
And did you guys negotiate this? Obviously.
So I spoke to the author. The author does not know how this was negotiated or how it affects his royalties. Royalties do come in, but they, I'm sure, are affected in some way. He doesn't even know if he gets royalties. Whatever. And so you can see this, whatever attitude to royalties is now beginning to pervade the faculty. And suddenly, this was John De Niro and I when we started with a group of people setting up the Data Science Foundations course. That thought was not in our minds. And it's not that lecturers get paid a lot, but the grief that you have to go through to get your book published that way, maybe we can do something different, and thereby make things more accessible to the students. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little walkthrough of the kind of thing Brad described was going to happen with his economics book. That's already happening with the data science book, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have faced and what we are thinking about, and how nothing is actually ever really free. Okay, so here is data8.org, and this, so we have a, I'll show you our textbook and so on. This has links to all our classes, and this page was created because now many universities want to do what we have done, and so the materials are here, the assignments are here, and here's how you do the infrastructure. And if you want more information, get in touch with us. And the number of people getting in touch with us is really quite remarkable. We've had to automate a lot of the answers because there's only one Ryan Lovett, and there's only so much he can do. So, all right, so what is it that we are saying we're doing? Well, here's fall 2017. I just came from that. So, here's the course. And so notice no big courses, right? Everything completely open. I am not using my Berkeley.edu credentials. Everybody can access this. And it says what we're doing every single day, and there are demos, these are the, I'll show you. And there are the slides. The video is protected. You have to have a Berkeley.edu address because of the compliance issues. Right? And so that's until campus figures out a way to make its YouTube videos compliant. Those videos are being kept just with other people. And here are all the assignments and so on. But we're here talking about textbooks. So what I would like to do is I'd like to show you the textbook and discuss a couple of issues. So here is the textbook, and I'm having this problem today. My computer and the textbook are not talking to each other. All right. So this has a Creative CC BY no derivative works license. And I would like to talk about the no derivative works because we changed that. We were allowing derivative works until we got to this issue of voice that has been raised before. Like we also are addressing the student. And I learned this from having done a MOOC. I did one of these 50,000 person courses. And what I had to imagine was the unlecture. Instead of me standing in front and lots of people in front of me all listening to the same thing, what was happening was in some other time zone, some person in their own room had their computer or phone open and earbuds, and they were listening to me. And so I was not lecturing. I was speaking as though the student was right in front of me, and I thought of office hours. And that is the voice. Right? It was not loud for one thing. It was an intimate conversation with a lot of you. Think about this. Right? And I would pause. And so I learned all that and trying to bring that over. And now I don't want somebody messing with that because it's my voice. You can see when you read that when it is Annie and when it is John, because we address the student differently. Right? It's important to protect that. So we're trying to protect that by please no derivative works. We'll give permissions. I mean, all our stuff's open. Right? So you can use it. But write your own stuff. And so what does this look like? Well, let me show you. So we start with some history. And everybody should know about John Snow. If you don't, please read it. So look, second sentence. To get your mind into the right time frame, try to imagine London in the 1850s. I'm talking to the students. It was dirty, it was smelly. We're talking to them, right? And so they understand this. And so this, of course, looks just like a book. And let's see how long this section is. It's quite long. There's the things, one of the things, maps. And this is way long for a section, in my opinion. Our introduction.
Could you frame the reference? Because it's actually very interesting.
Sorry?
Frame the reference as John says. It's
oh, could I, oh yeah. This was cholera deaths in Britain in the 1800s, and people were trying to understand. And the leading theory of disease was miasma, bad smells. And this was really cutting edge for John Snow. He was an anesthesiologist. Queen Victoria got her first anesthetic for one of her numerous babies from him. She loved it, by the way. She called him for the next few. He saw that people were dying in this house, but not in the house next door. And he said, look, they're breathing the same air. It for example, gets us on the first day setting a lot of ideas that are important for all data science. That's my context. The context that I won't go into now is that I was in London, and I naturally, every time you go to the Johnstone, oh, and he's still there. They moved his mum to a museum, unfortunately, but he's very much still there, still sitting like this, wonderful. Okay, this was just to give you a sense that we are addressing the students. What I'd like to do, if I can, openness. This book is open to everybody. Licensing is an issue. We are using data sets. Data sets, our criteria are very strict. It has to be A, open to everybody. It has to be in a context that a student will understand and be interested in without needing a lot of formal domain knowledge. C, the question has to address the question we are trying to talk about. D, we have to believe it, that it's not some movie story. And E, it has to make our point. Not easy. Not easy. My time writing this, much of it has been spent looking for data. And the wonderful thing about this medium, as other people have said, is that you can update. When I gave the lecture at 10 o'clock, and I was thinking to myself, why am I using the data from summer 2015? Honestly, why didn't I just use the 2017 data? And so I'll go back and change it, and that's a wonderful thing. Okay, but I want to show you what happens here. So one of our examples, and we try, as we said, we try to make our examples meaty, something that the students will be interested in. And so here's an example about jury selection in Alameda County. And there was an ACLU study on jury panels, and it concluded that the racial composition of jury panels in Alameda County was not what it ought to be, given what the eligible population was, and had you been drawing at random, you'd have got something different. Fundamental issue in data science. And so we do this with our students very, very early on. And so, here's some text. Now, of course, we compute, right? So here's, well, the gold bars are the actual panels, and the blue bars. By the way, our university, our code, our colors. Everything, all the diagrams are blue and gold. Branding throughout. Okay. And we talk about the differences, and we draw at random, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so here are the differences, and had you drawn at random, you would have gotten gray bars, and so on, and gray bars. So there's a lot of discussion and some computation at the end. The crucial thing about this page and every section of this text is this button. I hope you realize the students didn't know. They thought it was life advice. Like, visualize world peace. They didn't click on that until we said, no, that's there for a reason. Now, I'm crossing my fingers right here. I'm going to click on this. Everybody sing the Jeopardy song. Oh, good. Try logging in again. Oh, please. Really? Okay. This is because I logged in. My session must have expired. Okay, how do I try logging in again? Hold on a second.
Better than
Hold on. I wrote
better than B courses, which will dump your work you've done if it's logged you out while you were typing something.
Yeah, let me show you. Okay, what happens if you are not told to log in again is And this is available to them in class. Before lecture, it's available at the start of term. And so in class, the class has 1,024 students, which is very humbling list for computer science. The laptops are open, and they all have live notebooks in front of them, and frequently we will tell them, pick your own sample size, go for it. And if somebody gets something weird, tell me. And in a class this big, if somebody doesn't get something weird, you're not doing right. Right? So they are working, as you said, they have to have the keyboard in front of them. So what we've done is make every section of our book is in fact a notebook. And so our way of altering, where I have this thing that I couldn't get to work, my apologies, is made. It's created in each books. It takes a notebook, it takes a Jupyter notebook, and just turns it into a textbook like that. There is a way to download a PDF. I'll tell you something. I hate it. It doesn't look good. We're working. It is possible actually to make it look better, so we're working on that. The PDFs are awful, and so we need to actually work out how to get a downloadable PDF, even though the live nature of these textbooks is a wonderful thing. Still, we would like the students to not think about the code sometimes, and to think about concepts. And for that, we'd like them to curl up with that book on a sofa without a PowerPoint near them, maybe an apple or some chocolate, and just read and think. And so that is going to be important. The next order of business for us is to actually find a publisher that will make a decent version. And from what I hear from Jim Pittman, even though the PDF is legally available online, people are buying the hardcover and the softcover. So the students do want this. We were so enthused by the success of this. Students love it, by the way. We were so enthused by the success of this that I did it again, and now we have a probability book for the upper division course. And to my great disappointment, I learned from the first time today from Rachel's intro that we could have got $5,000 for each of these. What you don't know will hurt you. I want to end with a discussion of not free. Right? So the student ostensibly doesn't pay anything for this. But at a public university, we have to be very careful about the assumptions we make. We are assuming that the student has a computer and access to the internet. The student has to pay for both of those. So for Data 8, since we really want this to be accessible, there's been fundraising, and the library has a set of Chromebooks that are available for students who have either old computers that are fast enough or just no computer. So there's that. So the student does have to pay something, and that does, the university needs some of it. From the production side, absolutely nothing is free. The time of many faculty members has gone into this. With these online things, a huge cost and effort is sustainability, maintenance, right? All these websites that start out beautiful and 3 years later they're out of date, right? And whose job it is to maintain it? Nobody's, because they all have today's thing to do, right? So maintenance is a significant issue. We insisted, because we are doing this at an introductory level for students and who have no background in any of this, we insisted that the barriers be minimal. So we're not asking them to download any software, right? So they just open up a browser, which they all know how to do, right? So they do that. And so where's the computing happening? Somebody is calculating those numbers somewhere, but it's on cloud servers that Berkeley has agreements with Google and Amazon and Microsoft that are making that available. That needs to be sustained. So it's not free. But I think this is a very good place for the university to put its resources. If you look at that $32 million that the students will pay for their textbooks, right, and at a fraction of that cost, you can do something that really works for the students. And is, for me, I'll just say, And another reason for me doing the MOOC is I'm a statistician. And mine is one of the most maligned subjects. Right? Lies, damn lies, and statistics, whoever said that, and that's the approach, right? That it's somehow mystifying, boring, deceitful, I mean, you name it. But it's none of those things. It is used, it's the, one of the pillars of data science because it works. It makes sense. And we here, taking the lead of my, former colleagues, David Friedman and so on, we have developed a way of saying these things without hiding behind mathematics. Right? Explaining what it is and focusing on why are you interested in this question and what can you make of the answer, whereas everybody else in statistics seems to be focusing on that middle step, is can we make this? Right? So we've gotten away from all that. And this, the MOOC was my chance, and this is a chance to reach the world. Right? So that they actually see why this is important, why this is a good thing to do. So it was my effort to bring this working way of thinking to everybody, and especially to the teachers of statistics. If you have excellent open materials, then teachers of statistics elsewhere have access to this, and even the teacher whose school does not have professional development funds or who can't take a sabbaticals and actually go and learn something, has this and they can use it. And to our great delight, it's being used in lots and lots of places. So it's a good enterprise. It is nascent, I think. But it is, I agree, the way of at least the near future until the next thing comes along. Thank you. Well, I'm around, we're out of time.
Thank you all so very much for coming. I hope that everyone took something out of this. And just to let you know, we are running a pilot again in the spring and informally. So we would like to post the first pack for the
icon which is what they're doing. Right, rather than relying on something that is likely to be more.
I mean, I think it's a noble pursuit, the collaborative open source model to get things done. And this particular concern, they weren't meeting their needs for a long time. You know, the decision was fairly easy, straightforward. At least a hybrid model. Large decisions. Some people were burned by it. I get it. Yeah, I'm sorry. And actually, if there are things that you'd like to talk about that we could help you work on, I'd be happy to do that. But you're.
I think right now, defense is the thing people complain about. You're working on it. Someone comes into your office, they distract you for half an hour. You turn around and go back to working on it and continue to type in your open authoring window. And then you go to save and it's logged you out.
Yeah.
And it's lost your state.
Yeah.
And this was a problem that was solved in 1996. And it's not solved in Canvas.
Is that right?
And that's a bad.
I can't remember. But anyway, who solved it? You know what?
When it logs you out, it doesn't lose your state. So that when you press the back button, you get to where you were before. It was a solved problem in 1996. It's not solved in Canvas on bCourses now. It should have been solved before bCourses shipped. Okay?
I can look into that.
Okay.
To verify that.
Oh God, what a disaster this whole thing is.